Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture on Agile Methods. So last time what I did was I spent a little bit of time going over about Agile and extreme programming. Today what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at a second type of Agile development methodology, which is called Scrum. How many of you have heard of Scrum before? Yeah, so I see a number of people have heard about it. Some people haven't. Totally fine. Scrum is something that you may actually have heard of, or you may have actually come across. If you've done a co-op or industry, you might have actually come across it in a place of employment. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some details about it today. If you go on the course website, you'll notice that I actually had a reading for you to do for today, which I mentioned at the end of last class. If you didn't read it before, I'd encourage you to go and read it after. What I've got in today's lecture is mainly based on some of my own experience and knowledge combined with some of the stuff from scrumguides.org as well as scrum.org. So, with that said, let's just recap briefly what we've already talked about on Agile development. So as you recall, there was a dissatisfaction that came about from traditional software development practices, and a group of developers got together and they actually put together what they called this manifesto, the Agile Manifesto. And this was a manifesto for developing software in a new way, a way that actually had different values and a way that had different principles and practices. And what they basically really identified is that there are certain things that were undervalued in development, and they wanted to see that fixed. Things like responding to change, customer collaboration, the importance of individuals, the people who were involved in the process and their interactions, as well as the value of working software and getting software out fast. Those are some of the things that they thought should be more emphasized than they were being. So they put together this manifesto, and from this manifesto, Agile development or Agile practices came about. And so Agile has this set of values and principles, and largely you can kind of think of it as, it's sort of like the Agile values and principles. They're sort of in some ways like they form, I guess, a way of thinking about software that several other individuals and some of the people involved in the manifesto used to instill into new development methods where there were new practices. So based on those values and principles, a number of different development methods came about. Extreme programming is one of them, and we spent some time last time talking about extreme programming. And the extreme programming is something that has been around. It's one of the longest, I guess, active Agile methods, and we talked about it last time, and I'd encourage you, if you didn't attend last lecture, please watch the video on that. It's up on the YouTube channel. But there are other ones as well besides extreme programming, and two of the ones that are really popular right now are Scrum and Kanban. And this week, today and next class, I'm going to actually cover each of these in a bit more detail, and hopefully it'll be beneficial and give you some more insight into how Agile works by seeing some different styles of Agile development. So, as I mentioned today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Scrum. And Scrum basically is considered to be a lightweight framework that helps people, teams, and organizations generate value through adaptive solutions for complex problems. Now, that quote in and of itself doesn't really give you a lot of insight on what Scrum does. What I would say or take away from this is its lightweight framework means it's lightweight, it's in terms of the framework, the approach that it suggests is aimed at, it's people-oriented, it's aimed at individuals and organizations, where what they can do is if they're trying to have complex software problems, they can actually use adaptive methods to actually solve those. And when they say generate value, they're talking about being more effective, more efficient, more productive in terms of how you develop software. That's what their aim is. So that's sort of the definition of Scrum. But again, I think beyond that, I think it's also good to think about, to look into some of the foundational pieces of Scrum as well. And in terms of the foundation of Scrum, there's several things that are sort of form the foundation of Scrum. There's three things in particular. There's empiricism, lean thinking, and transparency. And you'll remember lean is something we heard before, right? Where did we hear lean before? In extreme programming, right? So although they're both agile methods, they also both have lean practices and principles as well. And the idea with lean thinking is really about focusing on the essentials, focus on the core activities, the core artifacts, the core practices, and reduce waste, right? You don't have things just for the sake of it. You actually you really want to have things that have value. So the core essentials are the things that provide the most value. The empiricism is an interesting one, which is this idea of knowledge is acquired through experience. And this is also a foundation of Scrum, which is this idea that, as you use Scrum, as you get more experience with Scrum, you should become more knowledgeable about how to do Scrum more effectively. And that's something that's important. Another thing is transparency. And they believe that both the process and work artifacts must be visible. So that means that, if you're working on software, the code should be visible. It should be accessible to everybody. The process should be clear. There shouldn't be any hidden parts where, the software, a particular version gets run and then somebody else does the testing and nobody knows exactly how, but that testing is done sort of as a black box away from everybody. Everybody should understand the process. Everybody should understand what's being worked on, and it should all be transparent. And the idea with transparency is that transparency can, there's this notion of transparency, inspection, adaptation. Okay? So if something is transparent, what does that mean? It's visible. If it's visible, then you can inspect it, you can review it. And if you can inspect it, review it, understand it, then you can then go further and adapt and improve. That's the idea, right? So if you've got a process and you've got software, code and stuff, if it's transparent, it can be inspected and then adapted and improved. And that's sort of the idea behind this. And in terms of the values that Scrum has, you'll find some of these are the same as XP, some of them are different. And I promise this is the last slide on sort of high level stuff. What we're going to get into next is the really hands-on of how Scrum works. And the Scrum values are commitment, focus, openness, respect, and courage. So, none of these, I would say, are values that are software specific. They're more values about workplace culture, team culture, and about how individuals in this process view the work and the workplace. So, with these 5 things in mind, what exactly is a Scrum team and how does it work? Well, a Scrum team consists of 3 different kinds of individuals. There's a product owner. There's a Scrum master. Does anyone know anyone who's a Scrum master, by the way? I see someone said yes. Okay, cool. And then there's developers. Okay, so you have this team of people. There's a group of developers. There's one Scrum master and one product owner. So what role do each of them play in the team? Well, the product owner, their goal is to be accountable for maximizing the value of the product, which results from the work of the Scrum team. So their goal is to really get the most out of what's being done. And within the Scrum team, they're there to represent the customer and the external stakeholders. So they're there to voice the stakeholders and the customer's perspectives. And within the team, the kinds of things that they want to do is they're responsible for establishing and communicating product goals. They're responsible for communicating and ordering product backlog items. Now, you're wondering, well, what's a backlog item? Don't worry, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Yeah, but in general, their responsibility is largely product focused, right? Maximizing the value of the product and representing the customer or external stakeholders. That's the real big things that they do. And then you've got a Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master, they're not accountable. Well, everybody, I guess I should go back. Everybody should be, nobody should be trying to minimize value of the product, right? Everybody has some responsibility for maximizing the value of the product, but the product owner is the one who's accountable for it, right? That's a little bit different. In terms of the Scrum Master, their accountability is for the Scrum team's effectiveness. So if the Scrum team is producing low quality code with lots of bugs, if they're not actually producing the meeting timelines, that kind of thing, ultimately the Scrum Master is the one who's accountable for that. And what their job is they actually are a servant leader. Remember, we heard this idea before of servant leadership, and this was something that Spotify does, where they have these servant leaders, Scrum Masters, and the idea here is that their job is to enable the Scrum team to improve its practices within the Scrum framework. So their job is if the Scrum team is ineffective, their role is to help enabling the Scrum team to become effective, okay? And some of the responsibilities that they do in order to sort of improve the team's overall effectiveness is they're responsible for helping to coach team members. That means coach them on practices within Scrum. They're supposed to help the team focus by removing barriers to progress. So for example, if it may be barriers to progress could be things such as internal team conflict, helping to resolve it. Could be external barriers. So let's say that the IT department at that company actually brought in some new monitoring software, and it included, it limited websites. So they were doing website filtering, and they actually were filtering websites that were used by the development team as part of their work, right? One of the things that the Scrum Master might do is actually try to look at figuring out how we can actually get access to the right information for the team so that they're not stuck with having to try to find other sources of information. And they're also, another role they do is facilitate stakeholder collaboration and a few other things. But largely their job is to be there to support the team and to help them be as successful as possible. The last group is the developers, right? They're committed to creating an aspect or a usable increment in each what are called sprints. Now, a sprint, remember how I told you that we have weekly and quarterly cycles in extreme programming? In Scrum, we actually have the cycle or the iteration that we do is called a sprint. And the developers who are on a particular Scrum team, they're a self-organizing group, meaning they decide how they work together, who's working on what, and they're responsible for creating the plan in terms of what they're going to do in a given iteration, sprint plan, adapting their work to the, that should say sprint goal, not spring goal, and holding team members accountable and ensuring quality. So just because the Scrum Master back here is accountable for the team's effectiveness doesn't mean that if somebody is not pulling their weight, is not actually contributing, it's on the Scrum Master to get that person to contribute. It's actually on all the team, everyone in the every developer, it's on all of them to actually to manage and to help hold everybody accountable. So those are sort of the stakeholders. That's who's involved. Any questions about that? Okay, and I see a comment here from one of the students about if we were doing something in the class. If our class was a Scrum team and we were actually developing, now it's actually a little bit big for a Scrum team to be honest, but that's okay. If we were a Scrum team and we were being asked, let's say, to develop a new scheduling software for, or I guess a software to help students see their course calendars or their course schedules. Okay. And we were doing this for the university to help them to be, so in that case, we would have somebody in here who would have more experience, know about the practices and stuff. It could be me, as was mentioned in the comment. It could be somebody else who has experience, would take the role of Scrum Master. The majority of other people would take the roles of developers and self-organize. There would be a product owner, so that would probably be a member of our IT department who would actually come in and be part of things, and they would be there to represent the customer, who would be Ontario Tech, and external stakeholders. Now, external stakeholders would also be students. So in that case, it's kind of an odd thing because you're actually developing something that could benefit you. But they would be there to sort of play that role, that individual. So there's sort of like, that's sort of the idea of how the structure would work. Is that helpful? As an example? Okay. So in terms of, so what I've so far defined is who's involved in this process. The other thing is sort of how does the process work? So the first thing you need to know about is the sprint. The sprint is actually the Scrum process is a short, usually less than a month long. It could be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. And it's the process, it's basically a Scrum process is composed of iterating over multiple sprints. So every 4 weeks, every 2 weeks, every month, whatever it is, you do a sprint and you keep doing multiple sprints till you've actually, till you're finished. And so that's sort of the idea. So, and remember, what we're trying to do in Agile is we're also trying to do frequent releases, right? And get things out early. So every sprint has the same as the weekly cycles in XP, where the goal is at the end of a sprint is to have something produced, have a working version of the product. So that's what a sprint is. It's the basic unit within the process in terms of the iteration. And if we kind of go a little further, let's actually look here a little bit at the process or the Scrum framework. So the Scrum framework, and this is from scrum.org, but the Scrum framework starts on the far side here with the product backlog. And what's the product backlog? Anyone know what the backlog is? Any ideas? Things that have to be done, the program, a list of features that has to be included, tasks to be done from the last cycle. Yeah, so in general, here's the super simple definition of what the backlog is. It's stuff that needs to get done. Okay, so it's a list of the things that need to be done. Okay, what is this? This in our case, the product backlog is equivalent to the stories, the list of stories that we would have seen in XP, or it's a list to or it's equivalent to a requirements document in a more traditional development. Okay. So it's basically, you can think of it as a set of features, you can think of it as a set of requirements, but it's a list of things that need to be done, okay? Now, as you go through, you have this product backlog, and what you're doing is, you start by doing sprint planning, and let me turn on the laser pointer so you can see clearly where I am. So you've got this sprint planning right here, okay? And the sprint planning, what it does is this is where the entire team gets together and plans what needs to be done next. Okay, and from that they set up and to figure out what from the product backlog needs to be done in the current sprint. And that's the sprint backlog, the things that need to be done in the current sprint. Now, how do you decide what goes in a current sprint from the product backlog? Well, you look at that list of things that are done in the product backlog and you figure out what has the highest priority. what are the essential things. Remember, it's a lean method too. So lean also means when you're cutting waste, you're doing essentials first. That also applies to things like your product backlog. So to be lean, you actually want to create the earliest version has the most essential features in it. So that means that you pick the most essential or the highest priority items from your product backlog. They become part of your sprint backlog. And then what you do is you actually go through a sprint. You're going through the sprint and you do what are called daily scrums. So you have the sprint backlog goes to one particular Scrum team. And what's a daily scrum? A daily scrum is a meeting. Yeah, it's a short, usually 10-minute meeting, stand-up meeting where it's just a touch base where you're, identifying any roadblocks, figure out, understand what everybody's going on. It serves as several different benefits. One of them is it helps with the transparency we talked about. It also helps us to adapt, and it also helps the product owner and the Scrum Master to share any information that they need to, as well as the developers to help decide if somebody isn't pulling their weight. They could actually bring it up there. They could bring it up in a side discussion, whatever they want to do. So they have these daily scrums, and once the sprint is done, it produces an increment. An increment is the new version, the next version of your software. So once you have this increment, then what happens? Well, what happens then is the sprint review. And the sprint review is where you review everything that was done in the sprint. And from that point, if there are things in the sprint, so if in the process of doing the backlog, there were a couple things that didn't get finished, or if you realized something different about the product backlog, like, oh, we realized that this here, we're really going to need to focus on these other features are higher priority now. Information from the sprint review feeds back in, and the product backlog can be updated based on the review you do of the sprint. After you do the review of the actual sprint, then you do a sprint retrospective. Okay? This sprint retrospective, unlike the sprint review, which is focused on what? The software, the product. The sprint review is focused on the process. And the sprint review is where you're actually looking and doing that sort of that notion of empiricism that I mentioned. Through experience, you actually gain knowledge. So through the experience of doing the last sprint, is there any knowledge we've gained about how we can plan better in the next sprint? How we can improve our process to be more effective, faster, have fewer bugs, work better, or even it could even be something like, more embody the values that we have, in terms of workplace culture. It could be something like that too. But the idea is that this will inform how we plan the sprint going forward, so that every time any knowledge we gain from the last sprint should go through the retrospective and actually inform our next time. We shouldn't just say, oh, it would have been great if we did this, and nobody does it, and then we just do the same thing as we did last time, not actually doing any improvements. Does that make sense? So there's a good question. Does the framework eventually end at the sprint retrospective? So at some point, this product backlog, so you might say, well, how does this continue to work? Like in terms of active development, like once software actually moves into a maintenance phase and operational, you may have a smaller team working on this, but you may still have the product backlog, maybe bug fixes and other things, right? So this can continue on. It just might be smaller scale. So the framework may not end until the software gets decommissioned, but even if it ends at some point where you ship something and then you for example, in those cases, like let's take the game development industry, where often you hire people to develop the game and they sort of have the same mentality as like a movie production, right? You hire everybody, and once it's produced, then everybody is done, and you just keep on a skeleton staff to sort of do any bug fixes and stuff. Even in those cases, part of what you want to do at the end of this process, you don't want to lose this information. So ideally, the people, so the Scrum Master and the development, all those people they're going to go on and do maybe in the same team, or they may go on and work in different teams in the same organization. But all of the experience they gained from the previous Scrum, they'll carry that knowledge forward to help with sprint planning in the next time. And if they're in a slightly different configuration with some different people, well, those other individuals are going to bring in the knowledge that they've gained from their sprint team, their Scrum team, and so on. And so there is an emphasis on not just sort of losing this when the project ends. I would say that even after like the final, if you think of there as being a final sprint, you would still want to do a retrospective just to see, so that you can maybe possibly document the best practices and feed that information forward to even other teams who are doing sprints, so that they can gain from your benefit throughout the organization. So I guess that's a little bit there. The next thing I want to do is I actually want to do a little bit of because I think it's always good to see multiple perspectives. So I'm going to pause the video here because due to copyright, I can't just include videos directly in here. So what I'm going to do is, the link is here. We're going to quickly watch this very short video, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. So I'll pause the lecture right now, and then we'll watch the video as a group. Okay, everyone, we're back. Thanks for watching that short video. I think it's actually a nice little overview, sort of how Scrum works, and from the perspective of scrum.org. It's a much nicer little video than I could probably, or have the time or the inclination or the ability to produce. So hopefully it was useful. In general, I'll show some short videos in class when it's appropriate. But if there's any videos that are longer than that, I'll ask, like with the previous video regarding software or engineering culture at Spotify, I'll ask you to watch them outside of lecture time. So a couple things that we'll talk about the video, and then I'm going to answer a question I see in the chat. So there's a couple things that came up in the video which I thought was really good. They pointed out a few things. So and some of these things can vary. Like they said specifically, it's a 15-minute the meeting. The daily Scrum is a 15-minute meeting. Yeah, it doesn't have to be 15 minutes. It could be 10. It could be 20. It depends on where you're working. So it doesn't. Some of the specific numbers they sometimes give in here aren't. They can be adapted, right? I know of places that have done things slightly differently and they work fine. And they still embody the values. So there can be variations on this. But in general, if you're in a company, if you, for example, do a startup and you want to use Scrum, best thing to do is try to use Scrum as close to the way it's described as possible, and then learn from what works and doesn't work to improve it and adapt it in a way that works for you, right? I think you need that experience before you can start sort of playing around with the suggested techniques and strategies. So a couple of things that came up again, which they actually talked about, which was one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that one of the goals of Scrum is this quick iteration, right? The other thing that they also talked about was that the increment that you produce at the end of the sprint, you're not required to actually only reduce an increment, a new version, at the end of a sprint, like at the end of 4 weeks, for example. If you want to, you can do daily builds that actually are released, right? So you're allowed to do releases inside the sprint if you want to. There's nothing that restricts you from it. It's just the requirement is you at least have to do it at the end, is the minimum standard, sort of. And that's part of why, and this is getting to the question that I see here in the chat, which is the Scrum cycle just for the short term, or can it be used both short and long term? And so one of the things is that the Scrum, you can use Scrum over a long project, if or it can be used over a shorter term. If you wanted to use Scrum only for the development, and then once it's deployed and for maintenance, you're going to use something else, you could do that, and there are companies that I'm sure do that. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that the sprint, and I'm not sure if this is what you mean by the Scrum cycle, The sprint, which is one iteration of the Scrum cycle, that should deliberately be short. Like, you should not have a sprint that takes you 6 months. Because if you have a sprint that takes you 6 months, that means that you may be releasing less frequently. It also means that the longer it sort of extends, the harder it becomes sometimes to estimate time for a bigger chunk of backlog items and so on. So keeping it short in small iterations of 1 to 4 weeks is usually more effective, and that's what you'll find. So that's just a comment. I'm just reading another comment here. I'm just gonna we'll address some of those questions after, if that's okay. So that's a little bit about how Scrum works, and in terms of the team and the roles of the individuals. They also talked about something about the definition of done. Did you hear that? Did anyone else hear that? Just me? I think it was back, if you go back to the video, they had the word done flash up and said you need to know about done. So here's basically the thing. And we haven't said what it means, so it's totally fine. So here's the basic thing, right? You've got your product backlog, right? When you start a sprint and you do the planning, you take a certain number of backlog items that are the priority ones and you put them in, that could be achieved in the current sprint, and they become the sprint backlog. And as you go through, your goal is to try to complete them, right? So when you complete a given backlog item, it's done, right? Does that make sense? Great. The problem, what they're saying is, for transparency purposes, it's important not just to think about something as being done, but also to understand what done means. So what does done mean to you? Does that mean it's been coded into the product? Does that mean it's been tested? Does that mean it's been released to the customer? So typically, the definition of done is really important, because what you want from transparency purpose, you want to actually know, what does it mean when something is done? And in the case of done, like, one of the things that I think is probably released is probably one of the standards, right? So if a product backlog item has been done, it means that it has been released and is operational. Like, that to me would probably be done, right? If it's been completed but not yet released, then I don't know, because someone else could create a new, because that's right, because at that point, if another feature comes in, it could actually conflict with that one, and then it doesn't work anymore, hasn't been released. So you want, because done could mean different things to different people, then you would actually want to define it so everybody understands, right? Because if I put done as being released, you put done as being complete but not yet released, someone else puts done as being coded but not fully tested, then we got a problem. So we need to understand what our standard is, and that's why we need to define that. And that's part of the transparency. Somebody has there's an interesting question here. What about the testing phase? Does that go in the new to-do list? So here's the thing. Testing typically is not, you could, I guess testing could be something if you want to do system level testing, or if you have some particular thing in mind for that. But in general, I would view within Scrum as testing as being something, and let me just go back here one slide. You'll notice here that within this sprint, sorry, the jumping of slides. Within this sprint, there really isn't anything here about design. There isn't anything about coding. There isn't anything about testing. Those activities are not in here, right? And really within that month, within that sprint, your team could be doing it however they want to a certain extent. They all have to agree, but whatever practices they use to do it are all done within this sort of, this sprint iteration. So there would be testing within the sprint iteration, right? And so on and so forth, especially if every increment is released. Does that make sense? In cases where the increments aren't released through this process but are completed and then released, major releases, there may be some separate testing that's done. But in general, those activities, those development activities, all occur within the Scrum framework and usually within a sprint. So a given sprint will include all those activities. Well, you could add additional phases, but the reality is you don't need to, because in general, every team could actually do it. They could, there is autonomy to a certain extent in the team, so they all may have a little bit of variation. In general, they're going to use practices within the sprint that are consistent with development practices at the institution, the company they're working for, and they're going to use development practices that are consistent with the values of Scrum. So I wouldn't necessarily say you need to add extra phases. I would just say within sprint, you have to establish what the standard is and the expectation is, right? In some cases, if the product backlog is more feature focused, then it may actually, the features may have been prioritized based on an existing architecture that was decided beforehand, right? Or it was known. Whereas in other cases, it may be something that's developed as part of, it's in the product backlog itself. So it really depends on the company. So yeah, is a sprint iteration for release or for getting a product ready for test? In general, I would think of it as being, it's for getting a new increment ready for release. But what I'm saying is that different companies could use it in different ways, right? You could do, if somebody wanted to, they could internally do their sprint and have a test version that they do an increment, which is tested, which is used internally, but then only every 6 months release a public version, right? So it really depends on the company. In my view is that more frequent is better, and I would say if it's possible to do frequent releases in that, every increment that you do in a sprint, you would release it. But it really does depend on the company and their practices. Okay. So something else that we didn't talk about, and if you remember, I said that there are sort of 3 things that I consider to be principles of quality assurance, and one of them is knowing what you're doing, knowing what you should be doing, and knowing how to measure the difference, right? And in the case of Scrum, what you should be doing is most likely Scrum as it's defined by scrum.org and so on, as we've discussed. What you're actually doing and how it's different, especially if you're new to Scrum, you want a way of measuring this difference and measuring how successful you are in Scrum, because one of the things Scrum also builds, remember we had that transparency, inspection, adaptation, where the idea is that you're continuing, and with empiricism, you're continuing to take experience and convert it into knowledge. So with this, you want to be having a way to demonstrate that you're actually improving. If I, in my sprint retrospective, say, hey, I noticed this seemed to be slowing us down, maybe we should try doing something this way instead, and I give an alternative for how we're going to do our unit testing, or how we're going to integrate work between different individuals in the team, or whatever. There needs to be some measurement to see what the impact that is on our Scrum process and our Scrum framework. And one of the ways you can do this is with a metric called velocity. And velocity is basically something called the number of story points done in a given sprint. And you might say, wait a sec, I thought stories were part of XP and that Scrum had backlog items. Well, yeah, it does. But a lot of companies, a lot of Scrum teams actually view each background item as a story, backlog item as a story. So the terminology can overlap. Some don't, some do. So in the cases where they do, what you can think of is the number of story points done in a given sprint. And so if a user story is so our backlog work items, right? That's the basic unit of work. You use story points as a measure of difficulty. So in some ways, in the same way as in extreme programming, where what we did was with every story we did an estimate of how much time it would take, right, to get done. What you could also do is use story points, where maybe you have a scale of 1 to 10 points, and you say this is a 10-point story. This is a level 10. This is a hard one to do. This is an easy one, or it might be a scale of 1 to 5. And then what you do is all of the work items, the stories that you've done in your sprint that you've completed, each of them have a story point associated with them, a number of points. You add those up at the end, and you see how many points did we complete in the given sprint of 4 weeks. We did 34. Last sprint we did 38. Or last sprint we did 30, right? This can give you an indication of how productive you are, right? It can also, in some cases, identify flags. So if you notice that, for example, it may be that, let's say you may notice that whenever I do, let's say we have a scale of 1 to 5. Whenever I do 5-point stories, we always underperform, right? Well, is that because your team isn't a good developer, or is it because the 1 to 5 scale, maybe the story point units we're doing aren't really representative, and we actually need a category to understand that some of these 5 points are actually harder than other 5 points, right? So it could be that, or it could just simply be that we need to come up with some better practices for how to manage more difficult user stories and implementing more difficult backlog items. So should a backlog item be normalized to take about 1 Scrum cycle worth of work? That's a good question. What I think you're saying is you don't normalize them in that sense. What I think is you want to avoid really large backlog items. Like you don't want to have a backlog item like, if we're talking about Spotify, right? And Spotify has been in the news lately, and Spotify has podcasts. You can do different types of audio, video, whatever. Let's say podcasts. They were like, oh, we want to add podcasts. So if you had podcast as supporting podcasts as one single backlog item, it's probably going to take a while, right? Instead, you'd want to break that down into smaller chunks. And part of that, and this is where the story points can come in, because if you have a finite range of story points and you have a backlog item and you're like, well, this is more than 5 points. If our story points is 1 to 5, you could actually be like, oh, okay, well, look, that's clearly an indication this item is too big. So we should divide it into some sub-items or sub-parts. The other thing is sometimes you might end up with an item that's too big. It doesn't actually get finished in a given sprint. And what you do is the work or the part of it that didn't get done, you revise into a new work item with a smaller story point score, and it goes back into the product backlog for the next sprint or for another team to finish. So it really depends on how an individual company, and these things are, there's not a rigid, one size fits all solution to how companies manage this, right? Some companies might manage, work items that are too big by managing them through the end process of your given sprint, where you then revise them into a smaller one. Other ones may actually have a process where they ensure before a backlog item comes in that it is of appropriate size, and if it isn't, has to be broken down before it's added. So it really depends. But the whole point that you should take away from this slide is that there is an emphasis on trying to measure how productive you are in a given sprint. And what you want to do in Scrum is you want to keep track of the velocity or the number of story points that are being done in a given sprint and track that over time as well, to see if you're improving, to see if you're, if you've actually, your performances went down and so on. And if it's went down, then when you do your retrospective, you want to actually be thinking about, okay, well, why have we not been performing as well the last 4 sprints? And figure out, maybe there was something you were doing that's changed. Maybe a barrier has come in that you weren't aware of that's actually causing an issue for people, right? And some barriers can't be resolved. Let's take, for example, the pandemic and COVID. Some companies that use Scrum, where they're used to working in the exact same office space where communication is easy, you just have to talk to somebody who's right there. They now work in a remote environment where there are other factors in their home life where they don't have as easy communication, where they're using different tools to communicate, where things like stand-up Scrum meetings now have become Zoom meetings. And, some of those things are going to impact performance. They're going to impact things like velocity. So how do you compare the velocity pre-pandemic when you were working in a on-site versus post-pandemic, or during pandemic, I should say, when you're doing it in a remote environment? And the reality is that if the production goes down because of that, or the performance goes down, like the velocity score, it may be that there isn't a real optimal solution, except that you have to realize that you're not as effective during a pandemic, and once the pandemic is over, that's when you may see an increase in the velocity again, right? There may be some things you can do, but you can't always remedy every barrier or every block to progress. So it's important to think about that as well. Okay, so in general, what we've done so far today is we've talked more about agile methods, which have become the dominant software development approach. And what I did today was I talked to you about a second second lean agile method, which is called Scrum. So we now covered extreme programming and Scrum. Say that right. References for this slide are, again, the Agile Manifesto, which I recapped from last time, scrumguides.org. I'd also encourage you, if you want, you can rewatch that video I showed. But that's pretty much the resources we had today. Yeah, and I appreciate that my saying once the pandemic is over, a good one. Well, I guess what I really mean is it's not necessarily, hopefully it'll be over at some point, but once it's to a more manageable point, let's say that, right? Because I think before Omicron, we were at a more manageable point where we were able to maybe do some return to workplace with different protocols in place and so on. So, we have to think positively, I guess, about these things. My only point about this wasn't to make any statements about the pandemic, but simply just to make a statement that there are factors that are sometimes outside the control of the team. And in those cases, you may see some of your metrics, some of the measurement that you're doing, you may see that impact in your metrics.